So, good afternoon and welcome to everybody to our workshop on macroeconomic consequences of technological change. My name is Christian Siegel, for those of you who don't know me, and together with Cristiano Cantoro and Wai Jiang, I'm one of the organizers. This workshop is hosted by the School of Economics and the Macro Growth in History Center at the University of Kent. And it's organized together with the Bank of England. The workshop is sponsored by the Money Macrofinance Society, whom we thank for support. In total, we will have 7 academic paper presentations, and I would like to ask audience members to mute their microphones and to wait with substantive questions for the Q&A sections of the program. So we will have 7 full presentations of 25 minutes each, followed by a signed discussant, and then there will be time for Q&A. And as already mentioned, we are recording the event for the MMF YouTube channel. And if you don't want to be seen, please deactivate your webcam. And we're very, very happy to be joined by Andy Haldane, the Bank of England's chief economist, who will deliver some opening remarks. And now over to you, Andy.
Well, thank you, Christian. And afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well, and delighted to be offering some brief, and they will be brief, opening remarks for this exciting workshop on the macro implications of technological change. As Christian mentioned, it's jointly hosted by the University of Kent and the bank, and sponsored by the MMF, and it's fantastic to partner with both of them. And we have a great lineup of speakers, as you all will have seen. And there's no question that technological change is one of the mega trends or signature issues of our time. We're seeing a flood, aren't we, of new technologies which are reshaping our industries, our sectors, our jobs, our lifestyles, from AI to big data to digitization. And COVID over the last 15 months probably has, if anything, given the hurry up to many of these trends, with people and businesses needing to adopt new technologies at pace to keep afloat and to keep in touch. And this new wave of innovation sometimes goes by the name of the fourth industrial revolution. And as with the first 3 industrial revolutions, the precise path it takes and its implications for the economy over the short and medium term and for jobs are the subject of pretty intense and often quite heated, in fact, debate. And quite rightly so, because we know from our history books that each industrial revolution has been a pivotal moment for our economies and indeed for our societies, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, for some positive, for others negative, winners and losers, which can span generations, decade upon decade. And the role of research is to shed light on these heated debates. And as we sit here on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, that's why conferences like this one, I think, are so welcome and indeed so timely. It's also why last year we published our research agenda at the bank, the so-called Bank of England Agenda for Research. You might ask the question, why wasn't it called the Bank of England Research Agenda? Well, that would have made for as catchy an acronym as BEAR. So we went with Bank of England Agenda for Research, or the BEAR, and that put issues of technology and its impact pretty center stage in the bank's own research priorities. So to kick us off, let me just mention 1 or 2 from a potentially much longer list of key questions, behaviorally or policy-wise, that I think are shaping this debate. And many of those questions are also discussed in the background papers we're going to hear from this afternoon. First one is, how long will be the lag between the wave of the fourth industrial revolution breaking and its downstream impact on macro outcomes in the economy, GDP, productivity, living standards, and the like? Now, as I imagine many of you know, that lag has a name. It's sometimes called the Engels pause, as it was first highlighted by Friedrich Engels back in the mid-19th century, after a half century, at least, stagnation in real pay, despite the Industrial Revolution having commenced at the end of the 18th century. At just the time, Sod's law, Engels highlighted this problem. It was solved, and pay and productivity began rising rapidly, and the full fruits of the first Industrial Revolution were harvested. But it had taken half a century the ideas of Hargreaves and Watt and Arkwright to turn themselves into general purpose technologies, GPTs, and thus to bear that macro fruit. Well, fast forward to the 1980s, we had a repeat performance. So you remember back in 87, or some of you will, the older ones of you, Bob Solow famously declaring that the computer age was everywhere except the productivity data. And at pretty much exactly that point, as with Engels many years previously, just at that point, it did start appearing in the data. Another example of Engels' pause, if on this occasion, a shorter pause of perhaps a decade or two. Fast forward another 40 years, and today, in the face of a global productivity slowdown, we're asking ourselves the same sort of question of the fourth industrial revolution. When will this revolution show up in the data? Will COVID be the catalyst for it showing up in the data? Will Engels' pause be shorter this time as it was in the second and third industrial revolutions? And indeed, what can we do? What can we do public policy-wise to expedite the diffusion of today's technologies into tomorrow's GPTs? These are massively important questions, as you all know, for shaping the future course of living standards, both in the UK and of course across the whole world. A second equally important, equally big set of questions concerns jobs and the jobs market, because past industrial revolutions, as we all know, have caused wrenching change in the jobs market as old jobs and old sectors and old professions are swept away by new so-called labor-saving technologies. Now, we know from history that at least over the medium term, this tended to be creative destruction, with as many, or indeed more, new jobs being created as those that were lost. And typically those new jobs created were also at higher levels of pay and productivity, hence the secular rise in living standards. Or put differently, in other words, the Luddite or lump of labor fallacy turned out through history to be just that, a fallacy. The labor share of income, at least over the medium term, was constant, or in some cases even picked up after industrial revolutions. But a key question for us today is, will this time be the same, or could this time be different? Well, certainly most estimates of the scale of likely job destruction suggest the fourth industrial revolution will be at least as much of a wrench as the first three, affecting anywhere between 15 and 50% of the global workforce in some way, shape, or form. It's an open question, I would say, generally open question, though, about how that will go on to affect aggregate employment and indeed aggregate labour income. Will enough new, higher paying, more productive jobs be created to fill that big jobs gap? Will new technologies serve as a substitute or as a complement for labour? Well, the theory papers written on the most recent industrial revolution make clear this could cut either way. It's an ambiguous question theoretically. Ultimately, this boils down to empirics, and we'll hear lots more about those empirics during the course of this afternoon. But the one thing I think we can say with a degree of assurance is that this new technological wave is a rather different one than the past. This is the first time we've had to deal with machines that think as well as do. where AI and robots can substitute for our brains as well as for our hands. And that does beg bigger questions about whether there are a sufficient number of jobs in the future where humans can preserve a well-defined and distinctive comparative advantage over machines. That's an open question, at least in my mind. And even if that were to be the case, and the lump of labor fallacy was indeed a fallacy again, are these jobs, these new cohorts of jobs, necessarily going to be associated with higher levels of pay and productivity for the masses? Or could we instead see an even greater bifurcation in the pay fortunes of the winners and the losers from the fourth industrial revolution? And perhaps accompanying that, might we see a secular fall in the labor share of income of the type we've seen in the US, but it seems to a much lesser extent, if at all, across Europe, including here in the UK. Well, listen, these are big questions. These are tremendously difficult questions. And the virtue of being the opening speaker is it would be terribly rude of me to try and answer any of them, even if I was capable of doing so. But what the organizers have done, Christian, Cristiano, Vey and others, is to assemble a fantastic set of people and papers to try and answer those questions and see whether we can resolve these huge societal issues of how best we make the most of the opportunities of the fourth industrial revolution at the same time as we seek to avoid some of the more obvious pitfalls that it doubtless will throw up for certain workers in certain sectors in certain parts of the country. So with that as I hope a useful framing and a couple of questions to get our teeth into, let me pass back to Christian and Cristiano to kick off procedures. Thanks all, everyone very much.
Thank you very much for this great introduction to the topic and sketching these very big and indeed very important questions. So this brings us to our lineup of 7 full papers. As I already mentioned, we got 7 papers. They are all focusing on different questions, spanning a wide range of topics that Andy mentioned. And the first presentation is by Joseba Martinez. Joseba, do you want to share your screen? And you will have 25 minutes for your presentation. Sure. After that, we will have 10 minutes for the discussant and another 10 minutes for Q&A. And again, as I mentioned before, can we please leave substantive questions for the Q&A section, not to step on the turf of the discussant.
Great. So thank you, Christian, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us and for putting together this wonderful program. This is Automation, Potential, and Diffusion. It's joint work with Johan Moenvorum, who's a PhD student here at the London Business School. And he's out there somewhere. So if you have any questions as we go along, you can put them on the chat and Johan will answer those. So this paper, what we're trying to do here gets to a lot of what Andy mentioned in the introduction. Okay, the goal here is to, this is a measurement paper. We want to, on the one hand, we want to capture some objective measure of the development of a specific type of technology, and that's labor replacing technology. And on the other hand, we want to see how much we can learn about the diffusion of that technology into the economy. Okay, so the automation potential in the title, that refers to the idea that over time, there's a flow of new ideas into the stock of knowledge of the economy. And those ideas only really materialize once that technology diffuses into the economy in the form of investment. So we want to capture both margins. We want to capture the development of that flow of new ideas, and we want to say something about the diffusion of those ideas into the economy. Okay, so to put it in the terms that kind of Andy said, we want to measure both that frontier, and we want to measure kind of the length of Engels' pause and think about whether it's different from different technologies and so on and so forth. Okay, so what do we do? So we're going to develop a time series of task replacing technology. Okay, and we're going to call that automation potential. Okay, so first things first, let me say what I mean by task replacing technology. Our interest here is not in thinking, or our interest here is in really trying to isolate the kind of labor replacing effect of technology. Okay, and we know that's difficult, and we know that's difficult for some reasons that Andy mentioned, that, you know, technology comes in, it's going to complement some workers, it's going to substitute some workers. It might even, for the same worker, complement and substitute some parts of their work. Okay, so that's a difficult task. So what we're going to do here is we're going to project the employment structure of the US economy away from occupations and towards tasks, and think of our technology as really coming in at the task level, and at least in theory, at that level, we have cleaner insight on the effects of technology. Okay, so that's the first part. That's what we call automation potential. The second part is we're going to measure the diffusion of that technology, basically by estimating kind of long horizon impulse responses of our measures of how many hours are worked in different tasks in the US economy to this technology shock that we're going to be measuring. So, and how do we do this? So the first thing is, we're going to take advantage of technological progress. Okay, so there's been incredible development in natural language processing algorithms, to the extent that they've become, I think, an essential tool now for economists. And we're going to apply these algorithms to classic questions. What can we learn from patent data? Okay, so there's a long literature debating whether or not we can use patent data to extract some information about the progress of technology. We're going to say the answer is undoubtedly yes, and the way to get at that is to use these kind of advanced algorithms. Okay, as I said already, tasks rather than occupations are going to be our unit of observation. And our approach here, we're going to try and be as agnostic as possible, as hands-off as possible, both on the sign of the effect of technology. Okay, we're not going to say, oh, we think our measure is going to have a positive or negative impact. We're going to let the data do the speaking. We're going to be agnostic on which technologies matter. Okay, we're not going to be looking just at robots, just at AI, or just at any other category. Okay, we're going to be agnostic on that dimension. And we're also going to be agnostic on which tasks exactly are exposed to technological progress. Okay, there's a lot of great work that comes before us on which we build, which says, which tasks are exposed. And those tasks typically were manual routine tasks. We said in the past, a lot of automation happened in replacing manual routine tasks. And we're going to be agnostic in that dimension also. Okay, although I'll show you later how we connect to that classic literature. Okay, so what are our findings? So the main thing is, we're going to find that this, our measure of the impulse response of task hours to our measure of automation potential is going to be negative, and it's going to be decreasing in the horizon length. Okay, so we're going to say we found here a method for extracting the component of technological progress that is labor replacing, and that technology is going to diffuse gradually, and we're going to say quite slowly into the economy. Okay, so we're going to see these long diffusion lags. The effect of technology is not going to be limited to the things that were obviously automatable in the past, such as manual routine tasks. Okay, we're going to see this effect of automation across different categories of work. But there is going to be some tentative evidence, and we're working to sharpen this up, that diffusion is faster and the effect smaller for less manual routine tasks. Okay, so if you think of trying to replace a bunch of factory workers, one idea might be, you have to build a big factory with a bunch of robots in there to replace those workers. That might take a long time, be a very capital intensive undertaken, and therefore we think that diffusion might be slow and expensive. Versus if I'm replacing maybe a typist, perhaps I just use Microsoft Word and that typist is kind of gone. Okay, so there's going to be some evidence for that heterogeneity in the data. And from the data itself, we're going to identify some stylized facts. I'll show you the data in a second. We're going to see sort of two waves of automation technology, one starting in the 1920s, which is for now where our sample starts, peaking somewhere around 1940, and then a very, very major wave of technology starting somewhere in the early 1990s. Okay, and the feature of that big wave of technology starting in the 1990s is not just a big wave, but also a decisive tilt away from exposure of more manual routine tasks to technology towards the more cognitive tasks. Okay, we're going to see a big tilting in the emphasis of technological progress. Okay. So I'll skip the literature. There's some great work out there, and maybe in the discussion, I can say a little bit more about how we relate to some of these great papers. Let me just dive into what we do. Okay, so I'll start by describing how we construct our measure that we call automation potential. Okay, and it's a process. So let me just talk you through quickly kind of the main steps here. Okay, the inputs and the outputs. Okay, so the outputs that we're going to use in our empirical analysis are going to be measures of, for tasks in the US economy, this is all going to be US data. For tasks in the US economy, how many hours are worked per task? Okay, so from census data, we know how many hours are worked for occupation. We're going to map that into how many hours are worked per task. Okay, and equally, we're going to construct, for each of those tasks, we're going to construct a measure of the exposure to our measure of technology that we call automation potential. Okay, so the first thing is we map hours per occupation to hours per tasks. And then down here in the bottom half of this picture, this is a kind of how we construct our measure of technology. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take data on tasks per occupation. We're going to put them through what's called a topic modeling algorithm. That's a way of boiling down, of condensing the data into semantically similar groups, topics. Okay, and that's going to give us a representation of the labor input into production of the US economy as a set of task topics, okay? A set of descriptors of work that are semantically close to each other that sort of capture, in the sense of meaning, that capture task input into production in the US economy. Okay, once we have those task topics, what we're going to do is we're going to use a natural language processing algorithm. It's called BERT. Okay, that's going to tell us something about the similarity of our task topics, of our descriptors of work in the US economy to the text of patents year after year. Okay, and by using that similarity algorithm, we're going to finally arrive at our measure of technological exposure of all of these tasks. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more detail. So the first step is this topic modeling algorithm. Okay, and what's that about? Okay, so to do that, we use this database, which many of you are familiar with, called ONET. Okay, and what ONET does is it takes a job title, in this case, industrial ecologist, and it splits that job title into descriptors, detailed descriptors of what that occupation does. Okay, so an industrial ecologist does researches environmental impact, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and in addition to telling us the detailed work activities that each of these occupations does, ONET also provides us a measure of how important these tasks are to each of these occupations. Okay, so we're going to use those two to create our measures. Okay, so what do? We create a big list of all of the detailed work activities in the ONET data, and we're going to feed those through our topic modeling algorithm. Okay, so the topic modeling algorithm is going to take those 2071 sentences. It's going to extract the meaning of those sentences and create a representation of these data that's smaller and more condensed in a semantic sense. Okay, so, and in particular for the data I'm going to show you today, we've gone for 45 task topics. Okay, so we're going to condense those 2071 tasks into 45 task topics. There's rhyme and reason to why we picked 45. We have some robustness around that. We can talk more about that later. Okay, but so step one, represent task inputs into production in the US economy in a smaller, more condensed set of topics. Okay, and step two is once we have those task topics, we're going to map occupation hours into our task topics. To do that, we use the information that ONET gives us. It tells us for each occupation how important is a task. We're going to use that task importance to map occupation hours into task hours. Now we have a nice time series of how many hours are worked in each of our tasks year after year in the US economy. Okay, so the next step is really the meat of this, the heart of this, which is to create our measure of automation potential per task. Okay, so how do we do that? So what we do is we have our task topics. Okay, those are just lists of keywords, and we're going to run them through a natural language processing algorithm, compare them to the text of patents, all patents, year after year after year. Okay, and that's going to give us a measure of text similarity. How similar is a text of our topic to each patent year after year? Okay, and then we're going to aggregate up those similarity measures. And the first thing I'm going to show you is what that data looked like. Okay, it looked like this. Okay, so there's 45 lines on this picture. And what these lines represent is, on average, in a given year, how relevant are the patents in a given year to a specific cluster of work? Okay, and you can see we go from 1920 to 2020 for now. We're working on extending this further back. Okay, and so this is kind of the first output of our natural language processing algorithm. it has one very salient feature, which is very high correlation across all the task topics and a very clear upward trend. Okay, so if we interpreted this literally, we might say, well, what this says is automation technology has kind of been monotonically improving over time. Okay, that's not going to be true. Okay, and one of the first things we learned in this project, which in hindsight is maybe a bit obvious, is that there are, of course, confounding effects. Okay, so we're using a natural language processing algorithm. So one of the things that's happening here is that because language is evolving over time, the evolution of language is going to come in and contaminate our measure. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to account for changes in language over time in how we construct our measure. How do we do that? Okay, so we go to what's called the Corpus of Contemporary American English. It's kind of like a live dictionary. Okay, it's a dictionary of, in the here and now, what are the most commonly used words in the English language. We're going to construct synthetic task topics, okay, made up of random words. We're just going to ask with our algorithm, if I just compare random words to the text of patents over time, what does that look like? Okay, and you can see this, and this is the result, okay, of running our similarity algorithm just on random words over time. We repeat this many times to create kind of an average measure. Okay, and what that looks like is similar, okay, a very strong upward trend. Okay, and what this tells us is something that, you know, we should have guessed in advance, which is that, you know, because the English language evolves, the kind of words that we use to describe stuff now are very different to the kind of words that were used to describe stuff in the 1920s. Furthermore, the text of patents itself is becoming different. Okay, so it's the case now that when a typical patent described, more words are used. Again, that's something that's going to fool natural language processing algorithms, et cetera. Okay, so we have to adjust for this. So we're basically going to use this random word score to adjust our measures to basically detrend our similarity measures. Okay, once we've done that, we arrive at our actual, what we call automation potential per task cluster, which this looks like spaghetti, but this is basically our detrended measure of automation potential for each of our 45 clusters of production. Okay, so you can still see quite a bit of correlation, but there are some, you know, which clearly decrease over time, some which increase dramatically over time, and so on. Okay, on average, if we average out across these 45 clusters, the time series looks like this. Okay, and this is, here you can see some of those stylized facts that I was mentioning at the beginning. Okay, we have this kind of first wave of increase in technology here that goes kind of from the start of our sample to somewhere around the 1940s, a kind of a drop off. Okay, we're thinking of this as a measure of flow of technology. Okay, not of the stock of technology. Okay, it'd be hard to buy that the stock of technology is falling, but this measure of flow looks like there is quite a bit of time variation over the decades. Okay, so kind of these two waves, and most saliently, most dramatically, somewhere around the early 1990s, this dramatic acceleration in the pace of our technological progress. Okay, and what happened there? Well, that's the advent of software. Okay, that's when software patents existed before, but there's this dramatic acceleration in software activity starting somewhere in the 1990s. This isn't just about software patents, okay, because of course we know that software is also embodied in robots, is embodied in all kinds of machines, is embodied in, you know, our phones, etc. Okay, so the effect of software is not just about the direct effects of software, but our conjecture is it's about the effect of software being embodied in a bunch of different technologies. Okay, so this very dramatic acceleration. You can see the effect of the what used to be called, I guess, the Great Recession. Now it's the kind of like the lesser recession, I guess, of the century. You can see this kind of slowdown temporarily, and then you know, if you squint, maybe like a slightly slower path post the Great Recession. Okay, that's it. So those are our ingredients. Okay, so now we have hours per task and automation potential per task. These are the ingredients of our empirical analysis. Okay, just before I go into the empirical analysis, I'm just going to show you one more thing, which is basically how we're going to connect what we've done so far to the classic model that says we can categorize work into this 2x2 space. Okay, where work falls somewhere on the manual cognitive spectrum. Okay, this is back to Otto, Levy, and Murnane, 2003. Falls somewhere in the manual cognitive spectrum and somewhere on this non-routine routine spectrum. Okay, and what the classic literature says is stuff in this quadrant, that's the stuff that really got automated in the past. Okay, and we kind of know that's true. We can see it in the world. Okay, so note that so far we haven't used any of this classic model. Okay, we've just used the topic modeling algorithm, fed it a bunch of words, it created some classification for us. We used the natural language processing algorithm to create relevance measures. Okay, we haven't told our algorithm anything about what Otto, Levy, and Murnane wrote in this classic paper. Okay, but we want to connect to this literature. So what we're going to do is we're going to again use our natural language processing algorithm. We're going to feed it in the text of our task topics, but now we're going to compare it to some descriptors of cognitive, manual, routine, non-routine work. Okay, so literally we're just going to feed our 45 task topics into our algorithm together with these sentences, okay, that capture the meaning of cognitive, etc. work, and that's going to give us a measure of how similar these task topics are to cognitive, manual, routine, non-routine work. Okay, this is one part where, you know, if depending on our descriptor of non-routine or routine or manual cognitive work, the results do vary. Okay, this is somewhere where we have had some input. You can imagine what we've done is try many variations of this stuff, and it's pretty stable. Okay, so that's what we do. And what do the results look like? Okay, so let me show you here. It's the same picture I showed you before, average automation potential across tasks. But here, instead of the complete average, we've done an average by quartile, where the quartiles are by manual routineness. Okay, so Q4, the red line here, those are the tasks that our algorithm says are the most manual routine, vice versa for Q1. Okay, and so you can see one thing that we learned from this is, you know, our data kind of agrees with the classic interpretation. Okay, that in the past, or, you know, it has always been the case that the most manual routine tasks, those are the most exposed to technology. Okay, perhaps because they are the easiest to automate. Okay, it was easier to program a machine to just do something routine and manual versus to program a machine to do something cognitive non-routine. Okay, so it is a case. You can see that these are ranked. Okay, the most exposed are the most manual routine, the least exposed are the least manual routine in the beginning of the sample. But you can see the other feature of the post-1990s acceleration is that exposure of the least manual routine, the most cognitive non-routine work, that has risen by far the most dramatically. Okay, so there's a big tilt in research effort away from trying to automate manual routine stuff towards trying to automate cognitive stuff. Okay, which again, I think that conforms with our intuition about how things have gone. Okay, so that's it for the measures that we produce, okay, our automation potential measure. The next thing is to get at the question of diffusion. Okay, so how do we do that? Okay, so what we want is pretty clear. We want an impulse response. Okay, we want to estimate the impulse response of task hours to a shock to our automation potential measure. Okay, of course, there are other measures of diffusion that we might choose. Okay, so in this example, our left-hand side is going to be a task hour measure, and that's because we believe that to the extent that our measure captures something about labor-saving technology, we should see an effect of the exposure of a certain task to technology on that outcome on hours. Okay, so that'll tell us something about the diffusion. We're working on estimating diffusion by looking at different categories of capital. Okay, we don't have those results ready just yet, but for now, what we're doing is estimating diffusion by looking at task hours to automation potential shock. Okay, so to put it in the language that Andy used in the introduction, to some extent, what we want to do is really isolate the channel of this stuff. That's really that lump of labor channel. Okay, we know that maybe I automate some other task, and this other task over here gets a lot of employment because it's complementary. What we really want to isolate here is that substitution channel. Okay, I'll say a little bit more about how we're trying to do that, but mainly, the main insight we think of this is that by focusing on tasks, that becomes a more feasible endeavor. Okay, so how are we actually going to estimate our impulse response? We're going to be using what's called lag-augmented local projections. Okay, so there's really great recent theory on this stuff. Okay, and what that theory tells us, so these are papers by Plagborg-Mahler, Montiel-Olea, and Wolf. Okay, what these papers tells us is, if you come from the VAR literature, what these papers tells us, we can estimate VAR impulse responses using local projections, but in some cases, local projection impulse responses are much more robust. Okay, and what are those cases? Those cases are, for example, when the data are very persistent, we know that VARs can give bad results. Local projections, particularly augmented with a large number of lags, are much more robust. Okay, and how are we identifying the impulse response? It's a very simple assumption. Okay, we're going to follow the recursive identification structural VAR literature. Okay, if you're not so familiar with the literature, the identifying assumption is very easy to explain. What we do is simply we assume that a contemporaneous shock to automation potential does not affect employment today. What does that mean? That means that in the same time period in which I create a technology and patent it, it doesn't immediately destroy employment. Okay, why would that be the case? Well, Engels pause. Okay, it takes time for technology to come into the economy. Okay, so that's our identifying assumption here, that in the first period, contemporaneously, there's no effect. After that, we place no restrictions. Okay, it could be positive, could be negative, could be anything. Okay, so I'm a little low on time. Okay, so I'm going to not talk about threats identification. Of course, there are limitations coming from data, coming from theory to our approach. Maybe we can talk about that. The headline is the main things that we think can mess with our results. We think they lead to attenuation bias. Okay, we're going to find negative results. We think that the main things that are problematic about our approach would tend to bias our estimates towards zero. Okay, so if anything, we're giving here kind of a lower bound of the effect of this stuff. Okay, so what's the actual specification we run? It looks like this. On the left-hand side, we have the log of hours, okay, forward, okay, t plus k, where k goes from 1 to 10. And on the left-hand side, we have, importantly, task level fixed effects. Okay, we know that there are these very large differences in how this stuff works for different tasks. We want to take that out. Okay, we want to look at the within variation. We want to focus on that lump of labor substitution channel. Okay, so we put in task fixed effects. Of course, our measure of technology and a large number of lags, 40 lags of our automation potential measure and 10 lags of our hours. Okay, so theory tells us this is a robust way to estimate that impulse response. And what is the impulse response here? That's going to be these coefficients beta k for the length of our horizon. Okay, so what does that look like? What does that look like? It looks like this. Okay, so this is the within task effect of a 1 standard deviation shock to the automation potential measure. Okay, so, and what does it look like? So in the beginning, for the first couple periods, no effect. And then you can see this cumulative negative effect, and it's not quite, but it's decreasing in the length of the horizon. Okay, so no significant impact in the short run. Over time, an accumulating negative effect. Okay, suggesting kind of long diffusion lags. Sort of the last thing I'm gonna have time to show you is same exercise, but instead of pooling all our tasks together, I'm gonna split the sample. Okay, I'm gonna split the sample in tasks that are above median manual routine. Okay, the tasks that we know kind of traditionally were automated, and below median manual routine, the stuff that we know in the past hasn't really been the subject of automation. Okay, and that's going to look like this. Same exercise, same impulse response. Okay, the blue line, these are low manual routine tasks. The orange line are high manual routine tasks. Okay, so you can see both are significantly below zero. Okay, so automation affects all kinds of tasks, or at least these two categories of tasks. And if you're a little bit generous with confidence intervals, you can see something about how the effect on low manual routine tasks is less negative, and also how it kind of flattens out faster. Okay, suggesting perhaps a shallower, faster diffusion versus high manual routine tasks in which the effect is more negative and more persistent. Okay, so we also have some occupation level regressions. Also in occupation level, we find significant negative effects and kind of similar performance. Okay, so I'll just conclude. Okay, so we propose a methodology to measure the exposure of tasks to labor replacing technology. What do we find? We find that our measure works. Okay, we're seeing these long horizon negative effects, and it looks like that technology diffuses slowly, gradually over time. Okay, we're hoping soon to make this data available so that other people can work with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseba, and right on time as well. The discussant is Miguel Leon Ledesma.
Okay, let's share my screen. You'll see that. Yep. Okay, well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I must say that I do enjoy Joseba's research on automation, and this is a really interesting paper, as he said, about measurement. So what does the paper do in a nutshell? It creates a measurement of automation potential of innovation. How do they do this? They first of all, they classify work topics or tasks in the US economy using some sort of more complicated, advanced, and full of fireworks type of cluster analysis, and classifying 45 topics, world topics in the US economy. And then using pattern data and text data from patterns, they analyze the similarity between these new patterns and each of these task clusters in the US economy. And this is the measure of automation potential. Okay. Then on top of this, they categorize these work topics into tasks, and specifically task contents, the manual routineness of each one of these clusters. And finally, using this, they test the effect of automation potential on employment outcomes. Okay, and obviously analyzing the delay, the diffusion time from the creation of these innovations onto the effect on hours. So they use an impulse response function, which is derived from local projections. Essentially, in logs, it is a regression of automation potential today onto hours in the future, where age here is the horizon that you're looking at. Yeah? So as I said, I'm jumping a lot of details here, but this is the essence of the paper. Now, the main findings of the paper is that it seems that technology accelerates, technological progress accelerates from the Second World War up to in the interwar period, essentially, and then from the 1990s onwards. Although we observe a slowdown in after the global financial crisis. Importantly, the more manual routine tasks are the ones that, as you would expect, have the most automation potential. Although towards the end of the sample, we start observing that there's been a rapid acceleration in the automation potential of the least manual routine tasks. And finally, what they find is that there is a negative effect of automation potential on hours worked at the level of these tasks, of these 45 topics, with significant delay. There is a slow diffusion of the effect of the shock to automation potential onto employment. So I think this is an important contribution, and just the contribution of creating a new database in which with which we can measure automation potential is important, and this could be a great tool for further analysis or testing of theories of things like employment polarization, for instance. The very trends observed in the data are, I think, important. So this is a great job. I've got a few comments, and some of the comments are about how to take this work forward in the future, and some others are a little bit more specific to how to improve their current work. And the first thing I would observe here is that I don't think we should be very surprised to see when we look at the impulse responses that automation potential reduces hours worked at the level of these work topics. And obviously, because this is essentially what you're getting from your automation potential measure is the degree to which a new technology is able to replace work. Even if your automation potential measure is measuring some, or is capturing some sort of labor augmenting technical change, it could still lead to a reduction, or could still be labor saving if the elasticity of substitution is low enough, right? Your beta coefficients, your local projections is capturing the impact of automation potential within each work cluster. So we shouldn't be too surprised to see that then that leads to a decrease in employment or hours worked. Of course, still another interesting thing which is still valid is that it takes a long time. It takes a diffusion process of a few years to for the effect of these innovations to reduce employment. Now, what I think would be potentially more interesting from the point of view of these theories of the impact of automation on labor markets is whether automation potentially in one category of tasks have an effect on the demand for other categories of work, on other tasks. Okay, so I'm thinking a little bit more about the cross elasticity of automation potential, not on its own category of work, but on others. That is whether automation potential, for instance, in a manual routine occupation is or not compensated by increases in the demand for other tasks and occupations. And this obviously would then have some implications about the likely aggregate employment effects of automation. This is obviously a bigger empirical challenge. And the reason I'm saying this is that, I'm thinking conceptually about a model. This is obviously what you have there is not a model itself, but I'm thinking conceptually about a model in which you produce certain tasks using humans or using robots, right? With a certain elasticity of substitution. Then these tasks can aggregate onto occupations, okay, with another elasticity of substitution. Or you can think of this X here as an industry rather than an occupation. And then final output is an aggregator of the different occupations or the different industries with another elasticity of substitution. Now, what your paper seems to be speaking about is mostly about the margin in this bottom equation here is the sigma beta margin. Okay, so suppose that you invent a new robot. The effect of that invention of a new robot on hours worked within that specific task is going to depend on the elasticity of substitution, and it's going to depend on this beta here. Okay, so you have a kind of scale effect of the robot, which has a positive effect on the demand for the task, and a substitution effect. And I think your estimates are speaking about this beta sigma margin here. And sigma is not exactly the elasticity substitution, is the substitution factor. But now, if we want to understand the effect of automation or robots on other tasks, that will then depend on this other substitution factor here, this rho t, and this alpha here. Okay, and then if we want to understand the effect of this automation shock on aggregate employment, then that will depend on our outer nesting rho. Okay, so that's why I'm thinking about testing the effect of shocks to automation within a particular task or work category on other tasks and occupations and the aggregate level. Now, obviously, empirically, you have too many possible combinations, but you could potentially think about reducing this set of combinations in your local projections by looking at different quartiles of the manual routineness of tasks. One thing that worries me a little bit about your local projections is that the time series properties of this automation potential for all different tasks are very similar. So they are heavily correlated. So maybe one thing that you need to think about is introducing aggregate factors in your local projections, or introducing some time effects, for instance.
Miguel, you need to speed up a bit.
Yeah. The reason I'm considering all the above and these comments is that there are other papers in the literature that are looking at similar things. And one of the papers I know is this paper by Webb in 2020, in which they are trying to measure also using textual analysis the automation or the employment effects of automation from patterns. So you want to differentiate, you want to do something different. Although the two works are not exactly the same, they're aiming at the same thing and you want to get different results. so I don't have much more time. I learned a lot about the paper, very rich and complex data set, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Joseba, do you want to take a minute or two to reply quickly and briefly?
Yeah, sure. So first thing is, thank you, Miguel. That's a really, really great, insightful discussion, and you've given us a lot of stuff to think about. So some of these things we're going after. Okay, so we're working on the cross elasticity estimation. It's difficult because, you know, part of the virtue of our data set is that you have this very long data set, so you can put in a lot of lags. And it turns out that, you know, controlling for the history is like hugely important in estimating these things. Okay, and that's something that our paper does that other papers that came before us didn't. Okay, so we're more confident that what we found is kind of robust. But that said, you know, if we want to put in kind of cross correlations, that means we have to put in another bunch of lags, and you know, and so we're really kind of stepping on our data. But that said, that's something we're working on, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to get something along those lines. For the rest, you know, a lot of food for thought, and you know, we look forward to you know, thinking about some of those issues. Thank you, Miguel. Really great.
Okay, thanks. So we have 7 minutes or so for Q&A. So now it's over to everyone in the audience. You can raise your hand in Zoom by clicking the reactions in the toolbar at the bottom. Okay, so we got a comment by you.
Well, thanks very much, Joseba. It's a very interesting paper. I have two questions. The first question is about the type of patents. So is there a way to see whether a patent is actually used in production versus some defensive patents? I think especially after 1990s, there's like a rise of non-practicing entities taking out patents which are just used in lawsuits, which may confound in the estimation of what technology that there is that's actually used versus just flowing around. And then the second question is about the extra labor saving dimension, because if I read patent, I've read a few, but I understand there is something like a literature review in every patent. And is it possible that just by the virtue of belonging to some literature that has a labor saving tradition, that you are automatically classifying that patent as kind of replacing extra labor, whereas the patent compared to the previous technology is just improving the efficiency of capital, let's say, instead of replacing more labor. So is there a way to kind of distinguish the two?
Thanks, you. So that's both very good questions. So I think they're related, which is something about kind of the quality of a patent or something. The first thing is, you know, if a patent is some kind of frivolous thing that I just patent because, you know, I want to claim my space. So I guess the way that our methodology deals with that is, you know, we would hope that if I'm, you know, a patent troll and I just put some tiny idea, it's unlikely that that idea would have a very high relevance score for any of our occupation measures. Of course, there's always going to be noise in this stuff, but our hope is, you know, we're really leaning on our, of course, you know, if I go out and patent a thing that says this robot can do absolutely everything in the world, that would be a problem for our measure, because that would look very relevant, but it's clearly a silly patent. Now, of course, patent office are supposed to reject those type of unrealistic patents. Okay, so for the first thing is we're relying on our algorithm to do that kind of hard work for us, and we could do some checks maybe to make sure what's going on there. The second thing about, I think, like about whether patents cite other patents or whether they build, maybe I'm misinterpreting. My interpretation is, you know, how do we know whether a patent is truly innovative or just like a little tweak on something that came before? Okay, and that's an issue. That's why, you know, we're interpreting our measure as kind of a measure of technological flow. Okay, so it's not necessarily the case that technological flow is hugely innovative, but it's adding to the frontier, or it wouldn't be a new patent. If we're trying to create a measure of the stock of knowledge, then we would have to say, well, this new patent comes in, perhaps it's marginally better than some old patent, and therefore it replaces it in the stock of knowledge. Okay, so if we're trying to create a measure of the stock of knowledge, huge problem. For a measure of the flow of knowledge, arguably, kind of a much smaller problem. But I don't know if I understood your question, you.
It's related, but we can talk more later.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sophie?
Yes. Hi, thanks. Very interesting paper. So I have two kind of questions. One is related to the comment by Miguel, which is, for me, it was very surprising that all of these text similarity that you got, these AP potential are so correlated. And I would be, even after you take out, these trends that are coming from just different words being used, it's still very, very correlated. So I'm really wondering, like, what is this measuring? It would be very good to see some, I know that it's kind of a black box, so it's hard to give examples, but I think that would be nice. Maybe you do that in the paper, I don't know. And the other question that I had is that, can it be that some of these technologies are invented because they think there will be a labor shortage in certain areas? So they foresee, that there won't be enough people who want to do that type of jobs, and then they invent the technology. So it's a kind of reversed causality. I mean, in that case, it still would be automating or replacing those types of hours, but it would be a slightly different mechanism, maybe.
Thank you, Sophie. So I'll start with the second point. I think that's a great point. I hadn't thought about. I thought about the other thing, which is, there's a big shock to labor demand, and we know that stuff is very persistent. I mean, you guys have a bunch of papers showing that those shocks are kind of very persistent. And so maybe if I foresee a huge increase in labor demand, I start automating a lot. Okay, and that would clearly be an issue here, which would kind of attenuate our results. I think the thing you're describing would actually lead to kind of a downward bias in our estimates. That's something we have to think about. Perhaps it's something we can control for. These kind of labor shortages. For the correlation, yeah, so that's a concern. So we just this week produced kind of a new measure, which I didn't want to put in because the version of the paper that Miguel saw didn't have it in, but we've produced kind of a new measure of relevance in which what we do is we remove a lot of irrelevant patents from our sample. Okay, so focus only on patents that are kind of highly relevant. And that measure is much less correlated and has some other properties. And the results continue to hold, at least qualitatively. Okay, so hopefully in a new version of the paper, we've kind of addressed the kind of correlation concern. The other thing we're doing is, in addition to looking at hours, which is a very direct thing, we're also estimating some kind of technological diffusion. Okay, so looking at how certain AP, maybe in my prior as well, if it's a very manual routine AP, that should predict a lot of, say, robot investment or a lot of whatever, machine tool investment. If it's a very cognitive AP, that should predict, say, software investment. Okay, so that's something that we're also working on, kind of as validating the measure, making it a little bit less black box.
Okay, thanks. I just one more thing. Can I say one more thing? That could you assign somehow like task wages or task
yes, sorry,
prices?
we're doing that
then
too.
You could
sorry,
think
yes.
about like substitution versus augmenting technologies. Maybe you could distinguish those.
Yes, sorry, I forgot to say thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Miguel, for bringing that up. We're also working on a measure of wages, task wages. Again, that'll help us give some more structure. Okay, so that's something we're working on as well. Thank you guys for all the comments.
All right, thank you, everyone. So now we move on to our second paper, which is by you. So our next speaker is Jonas Löbbing. Jonas, you want to share your screen?
Yes, let me share that. Okay, can you see it?
Okay, you got 25 minutes.
Yes, okay, thanks, Christian. Thanks also for inviting me. That was super interesting so far. So I hope with my talk it stays like that. So motivation for the project is that inequality in labor incomes has been increasing and is still on a rising trend in many countries. And there is a large empirical literature that attributes part of these, or substantial part of these increases in inequality to skill-based technical change. So changes in production technologies of firms that raise wage inequality. So from a policy perspective, an important question is how to regulate skill-based technologies, or put differently, whether there is a way to steer technology into a more equitable direction. And existing work on that topic has mostly focused on direct taxes on particular skill-based technologies, such as taxes on industrial robots. So my view is that this approach is extremely challenging to implement on a broad scale, because for that we have to really precisely identify a large share of all the skill-based technologies in the economy. And while empirical research has successfully done that for industrial robots, so has successfully identified industrial robots as one of the driving forces of rising wage inequality, and I'm glad to see people like Joseba, for example, and others like still making progress on that end. I still think that currently we don't really have a very precise idea of what exactly all these technologies are that have potentially driven wage inequality upwards over the last decades. And even if we knew, we still would have to find a way to really practically implement particular taxes or specific taxes on these technologies. For that, for example, you would first have to come up with a definition of this of a technology that is well, broad enough to prevent firms from easily avoiding the tax, but at the same time precise enough to be really legally applicable. And then, of course, you would also have to create like a credible threat for firms that their technology usage is actually checked by the government. So I think at the current stage of research on these topics, I'm not very optimistic about really implementing these direct taxes on skill-based technologies on a broad scale throughout the economy. So instead, my approach is to ask, well, what is the optimal policy if we cannot perfectly target these skill-based technologies with direct taxes? And I show in this project that well, the direction of technical change can also be affected indirectly via the income tax. And the basic idea behind that result is really that when you have a more progressive income tax, and here I talk about a progressive income tax in the sense of having higher marginal tax rates for high incomes and lower marginal tax rates for low incomes, then such a progressive income tax stimulates the labor supply of low skill relative to more skilled workers. And so then on the labor market, low skilled workers become more abundant, and that incentivizes firms to use and also develop technologies that are more complementary to the low skilled. Because firms always have an incentive to use exactly those technologies that are complementary to those other input factors that are in abundant supply. So if you see many low skilled workers on the labor market as a firm, you have an incentive to use and also like further develop those technologies that are complementary and with which you can make good use of these low skilled workers. And then I show that responding to this question here, when you think about optimal policy, accounting for these mechanisms, then you find that the optimal income tax becomes more progressive when you account for these endogenous changes in production technologies in response to income taxes. So here's a brief overview over the model that I use to study these questions. I basically merge a Malese model of optimal income taxation on the worker side with a directed technical change model in the spirit of the models developed by Doron Atomoglu in a series of papers in the 2000s. That will be like the production side of the model. And then I use that model to ask, what is the optimal policy when taxes on technologies are restricted? And I'll show you exactly in what way I restrict taxes on technologies. So here are some more details. There are basically three groups of agents in the model. The first are workers. So we have workers of different types, these types indexed by theta. So you can think of these theta as indexing the skill of the worker, a higher theta meaning a higher skill. These workers choose their labor effort, L, taking wages as given, and they consume. Utility here is quasi-linear, and that is just to derive easily transparent analytical results and can be relaxed in the numerical quantitative part. Income of the workers is given by just wages times their labor effort. Then the second group of agents are final good firms. These are perfectly competitive. They employ labor and intermediate goods, denoted here by Q, to produce the consumption good that is consumed by workers. Production function of these final good firms is denoted by this capital G here. And the important thing really here is that there are many different types, also not only of workers, but also of intermediate goods. So this Q here is a vector of different types of intermediate goods, which I index by J. And these different types of intermediate goods, they embody different technologies, and they have different complementarity relationships with the different types of labor. So just to fix ideas, you can think of a model where you have two different types of intermediate goods. One is skill biased in the sense that if you increase the input of this intermediate good, then you get rising wage inequality. And the other is like the opposite, that is more complementary to low skilled workers. So if you increase the input of that other intermediate input, then you get a reduction in wage inequality. And then the third group is R&D firms. So these firms produce these intermediate inputs and supply them to final good firms. R&D firms are monopolistically competitive, so they do make profits. And out of these profits, they can finance investments, so R&D investments, into the quality of their output. In particular, to obtain a quality, so these phi here, these are the quality levels of the different types of intermediate goods. And to obtain a quality level phi j, an intermediate good firm, no, an R&D firm here, has to invest Cj or phi j R&D resources. So the Cj, you can think of that as the R&D cost function of these R&D firms. And then in terms of the supply of R&D resources, I assume here just that there's an exogenous supply of these resources of C upper bar, but that is not crucial. You can relax that and think of like R&D resources being produced, for example, out of final good again. And but with this exogenous supply, I get just an R&D market clearing condition that the total R&D resources used by R&D firms does not exceed supply. So that is like a sketch of the model that I use here. It's really a merger of a Milesian type income, optimal income tax model on the worker side with a simple version of a directed technical change model on the production side. The government here has basically two policy instruments. The first is a nonlinear income tax, and the second is a tax on a subset of intermediate goods and R&D investments. And here, as a baseline, I will assume that the government, in terms of taxing intermediate goods, so taxing technologies and taxing R&D, really only has access to a uniform tax on all the intermediate goods. But that can be relaxed. What is important is that the government, so what is really important for my results is that the government cannot perfectly target all the different intermediate goods and R&D investments, so in the different types of intermediate goods, by a separate tax. So as soon as you have some goods, some of these intermediate goods that cannot be perfectly targeted by a separate tax, qualitatively my results go through. And so here, this is just a rough benchmark where the government cannot really distinguish between any of these intermediate good types, that just has the same tax on all of them. And then, well, the objective of the government is a welfare function, where I denote the partial derivatives of that welfare function by T of theta, so I call that welfare weights. And I assume, in order to really study redistributive taxation, I assume that that welfare function exhibits a concern for equity, in the sense that if utility levels are increasing in theta, in skill, then welfare weights must decrease. And that gives rise to an objective where the government actually wants to redistribute resources from high income earners to low income earners. So the planning problem for the government is then really to maximize welfare using the income tax and the intermediate good tax, subject to, well, equilibrium conditions. So all agents make optimal choices given prices. And so here, this intermediate good tax, you can really think of that as like a tax on, I mean, intermediate goods here, you can think of them as different types or different forms of capital. And then the intermediate good tax is really just a tax on capital that cannot distinguish between the different forms of capital. So that's the setup. And in terms of results, here is like one of the main equations that I derive. So when you solve this, this government problem, you can derive a characterization of the optimal marginal income tax rates on the left-hand side here. And on the right-hand side, I have put the version of this characterization that I get when I assume that final good firms production function has a constant elasticity of substitution with an elasticity of substitution given by sigma. But this is really just because this special case leads to a very simple formulation. The main insights are way more general. Now, when you look at this optimal tax formula here, you have three different parts. The first part here, printed in black, is really a standard, what is called ABC part, following Diamond's famous paper on optimal income taxes, which features the elasticity of labor supply with respect to the marginal tax rate. That is capturing the effect that if you increase marginal tax rates on a certain income, then you lose revenue because the persons who earn that income level, they reduce their income. So it's you can also think of that as being a measure for the strength of the distortions that you induce with the income tax. Then the second part here is the inverse hazard ratio of the income distribution divided by the income level Y. That is a measure for how much revenue you can get by increasing marginal tax rates at a given income level. And finally, you have this G bar, which is the average welfare weight of individuals with type and therefore also with income above theta. And that measures, well, the welfare losses that you get from raising the tax burden for individuals with income above Y of theta. So this is like a standard part, these are standard forces that affect optimal marginal tax rates in many models. Now the two parts here at the end, they are more specific. The first one in blue is what I call within technology complementarity between labor types. I'll explain where that comes from. First, let us think about the sign of it. So we know that by this assumption on the welfare function, welfare weights will be decreasing. And then, so here's a minus, so this entire term will be decreasing as well. So it will be, in particular, it will also be negative for high skill levels theta, and it will be positive for low skill level theta. So overall, that will have a regressive impact on the optimal income tax. So it calls for lower marginal tax rates on high incomes and higher marginal tax rates on low incomes. And the intuition here is that, well, a regressive or more regressive tax by imposing lower marginal tax rates on high incomes, higher marginal tax rates on low incomes, stimulates the labor supply of high skilled relative to low skilled workers. And then if you hold technology constant, so this is abstracting from these endogenous technology adjustments, then you get that wage inequality goes down because you have more high-skilled workers in the market, their wage goes down, you have less low-skilled workers in the market, their wage goes up. So that's why you have here this regressive adjustment term coming from this, what I call within technology in the sense of holding technology constant, complementarity between worker types. And then the final part, the one in red, is really what comes through these endogenous technology adjustments. So that is the part that comes from directed technical change, so from endogenous R&D decisions of firms. That has the opposite sign to the blue one. It is positive for high skills and negative for low skills. So it really is a progressive adjustment. You want to have higher marginal tax rates at the top and lower ones at the bottom. And the intuition here is the one that I gave you in the introduction, basically. So the intuition here is that with a more progressive tax, you stimulate labor supply of less skilled workers relative to more skilled workers. And then firms see this increased supply of low skilled workers on the labor market and choose technologies that are more complementary to the low skilled. And that then gives rise to a reduction in pre-tax wage inequality from a more progressive tax. And here I put that pre-distribution. I named that or called that pre-distribution because so with a progressive tax, you not only get redistribution in the sense that you can reduce inequality in post-tax incomes, but here, because of these directed technical change effects, you can even get pre-distribution, so a reduction in inequality pre-taxes. Okay, so in the paper, I have some analytical results comparing taxes with and without directed technical change. But here, I really want to focus on the quantitative implications of this. So let me talk about that next. So calibration of the model is very standard for many, or not very complicated for many parts of the model. I just need some estimates for labor supply elasticities from the literature, and then the remaining part of the model is really identified by matching an income distribution under a representation of the current tax system. And I calibrate the model to the US income distribution or to the US economy in 2005. But that is, of course, arbitrary. The key in the calibration is really to calibrate the elasticity of substitution sigma and this parameter rho. So when I go back to the formula, the sigma parameter is the one that governs the strength of these within technology complementarity effects. And the rho is a parameter that governs the strength of these directed technical change effects. So these are key really to understand the magnitude of these effects on the optimal tax. And in the model, they have a very, very clear interpretation. So these parameters give the elasticity, so in the model give the elasticity of relative wages between two different worker types with respect to these worker types' relative labor inputs. So if you increase the relative labor input of a given type relative to the other, then the relative response of the relative wage between these workers is given by these two parameters, where one of them holds technology constant and the other accounts for the technology adjustment. And now to identify them from the data, basically, or from empirical studies that have estimated these kind of elasticities, I assume that the effects holding technology constant, so that are induced via the elasticity of substitution, they materialize relatively quickly, while the adjustment of technology, so of R&D investments here in the model, takes time. Which means then that short-run estimates of the response of relative wages to relative labor inputs identify the elasticity of substitution sigma in my model, whereas long-run estimates identify the total effect, which accounts for technology adjustments. And this is given by the sum of the two. So -1 over the elasticity of substitution plus that parameter rho. And what I find in the literature that estimates these kind of effects also over the long run is that long run estimates range from, and in long run here, I talk about estimates for a time horizon of about 10 to 15 years. That is what is available in the literature. And what they find is an elasticity of relative wages with respect to relative labor inputs of about -0.1 to 0.5. And given that, well, I don't really have any means of discriminating between these two, I report results for both of these like extreme values of the range of estimates that I get from the literature. And so in terms of results, what I get out of that calibration is the following. So here you have optimal marginal tax rates on the vertical axis and income in $1,000 on the horizontal axis. And we have three different cases. The first is the one where I have strong directed technical change effects. So where I calibrate this long run elasticity here to the upper bound of the estimates that I get from the literature. Then I have weak directed technical change effects where I use the lower estimate. And finally, as a benchmark or as a case for comparison, I also include the case where I completely abstract from these endogenous technology adjustments, and where I just say, okay, we treat technology as something that happens exogenously and does not respond to other things in the economy. So that is the blue case. And what you see is that when you introduce directed technical change, you get, as suggested by the analytical results, you get higher marginal tax rates for high incomes, and the increase is especially pronounced here in a range between $100,000 and $400,000. And you get lower marginal tax rates below the median income. So the median income here is denoted by this vertical line. And you also see, okay, if directed technical change effects are stronger, of course, the effects become stronger. But you also see that these effects here in terms of marginal tax rates are really sizable. So you have downwards adjustments here relative to the case where you ignore technical change of up to 15 percentage points, and you have upwards adjustments of up to 10 percentage points for the baseline calibration. Of course, if you like play around a bit with labor supply elasticities or things like that, then things can get even bigger, but also a bit smaller. Okay, so as a summary, just this is what I basically described just verbally. So what you get from directed technical change is a reduction in marginal tax rates for below median incomes of about 5 to 15 percentage points at the max, and an increase in marginal tax rates between, especially in this area between 100,000 and 400,000 US dollars, of about 3 to 10 percentage points. And what is also a bit remarkable here, especially when you compare that to like the existing optimal tax literature, is that when you have strong directed technical change effects, then marginal tax rates are actually monotonically increasing with income over the bulk of the income distribution. Not at the very lower bound, but for like the area of the income distribution, or the range of incomes where most of the people are located. You have monotonically increasing marginal tax rates, which is also, by the way, well in line with many tax systems observed in reality. So here's a summary of what I've just said. So I show in this project that policy can steer technical change in a more equitable direction by setting a more progressive income tax. The basic idea is that a more progressive tax stimulates the relative supply of low-skilled workers and induces firms to choose technology that are more complementary to the low-skilled. And then I show in the optimal tax analysis that the optimal redistributive income tax is then, once you account for these directed technical change effects, more progressive than when you do not, and it is so in a quantitatively relevant way. And given that I have, I think, 1 minute left or so, I can talk a little bit about something that is not in the presentation, but that is still in the paper, where I look at the impact, just like from a positive point of view, just the impact of tax reforms. And I look at the impact of tax reforms in the US that have happened since 1970. So this framework that I've developed here implies that, or predicts that regressive tax reforms induce skill-biased technical change. So I want to know, well, have these regressive tax reforms that have happened in the US over the last 50 years, have they contributed in a quantitatively relevant way to skill-biased technical change at that period? And what I find is that, okay, these reforms can explain up to 10% in the rise in wage inequality as measured by the 90 to 10 percentile ratio, which is not super large. But I also want to emphasize here that the model was really made for the optimal tax analysis. And by that, because I do this nonlinear tax analysis, it has to be a bit simplified at certain margins. So especially I think that I don't have endogenous education responses or occupation responses, occupation choices here in the model, which may all work to like amplify the labor supply responses that in the end you see in response to tax reforms. And that would also amplify the effects here on skill-biased technical change. So that's why the tax reform analysis is not really at the, or this analysis here is not really central in the paper, because I think the model is not exactly tailored to do this analysis. But still, it's an interesting piece, I think, that comes out here. Okay, thanks. I'm looking forward to the discussion then.
Thanks a lot. The discussion is Miltos Makris.
Thanks, Jonas, for the very clear presentation. Actually, it was very clear. Thanks a lot. I'll share my screen, I guess. Is it? Can you see it? Is it okay?
Yes, and you got 10 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. It was very clear, actually. It simplifies my work a lot. I have a few. So yeah, I guess I'll go through the basic intuition, which is it's very neat, very clear, and it has been made clear also in the paper and in the presentation. So I'll go very quickly through that in my own words, I guess. So one can say that the paper is asking the following question: what are the implications for income taxation of directed technical changes being endogenous? And the starting point is the observation that they are inducing innovations that are more complementary to the less skilled can suppress, if you like, the income distribution and can alleviate, therefore, income inequality. However, the complication that arises here is that there are two effects. There is a direct effect that arises simply from the direct effect from the complementarity from the direct effect of the complementarity on wages, keeping labor allocation fixed. And there's also the indirect effect, which comes through the diminishing returns. So, the more labor, the lower the wages. So if you change the relative allocation of labor, you change as well the distribution from that channel. So ultimately, what the theory basically tells us is that it's a race between these two effects. And this, the winner of the race is the effect that has the highest elasticity. So the progressivity result that Jonas has emphasized arises when the direct effect dominates the indirect effect, or in other words, if the DTC elasticity dominates is higher than the within technology elasticity, which ultimately boils down to the summation of the rho plus gamma in the paper, but 1/sigma in the presentation, of whether this is positive or negative. So if this condition is satisfied, then indeed inducing a DTC can be beneficial in terms of alleviating the inequality, and therefore this gives an incentive to the planner to implement a more progressive income tax in order to induce these inequality beneficial technical changes. Now, given that the theory basically says that it's a race between these two effects, ultimately the whole point is to try to get some quantitative sense of this, which is what makes the calibration important. So I'll have some suggestions which are in terms of the calibration exercises. I think this part of the paper would benefit a lot if a subset, at least, of these suggestions are taken into account. So the first one is basically kind of basic. So I would ask for more comparative statics and for more sensitivity analysis in the calibrations. So for instance, the inequality aversion is calibrated to match the 2005 tax in the weak bias case. So one could ask what would happen if you match the strong bias case. You have transferable utility, or in other words, quasi-linear utility. So one could ask how the tax would change if there is change in the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. We know in the literature on the income taxation that changes both in the inequality aversion and the concavity of the utility have quite drastic effects in the shape of the taxation. So an interesting question here would be how this thing could interact with the effects that come from the DTCs. The second question is also motivated by what is done nowadays in the income taxation literature, especially the dynamic one. So because we know that the optimal non-linear tax is quite complicated, one criticism of this literature that comes from the more applied people or the practitioners is that, these things are too complicated. How on earth are we going to implement this in reality? So one exercise that has been taking place recently in the literature is to ask what are the welfare losses compared to the optimum by using the optimal linear tax. So in this particular model, one would calculate the optimal linear tax, either analytically or numerically, and then compare the welfare losses compared to the optimal reform. And if in general these losses are very small, one can say, well, there you go. The practitioners, you can do the linear tax, and we propose also this rate, and by that rate, we can capture most of the benefits of the optimal non-linear tax. The last point comes from enabling actually the paper to bring out more what are the implications for the income tax of the DTCs being endogenous. What I propose is to beef up a bit more this impact, is to conduct the following counterfactual exercise. So the spirit of this is to say, imagine a situation where you have someone who would like to do a quantitative exercise and knows the long-run estimates, say are -1, which is in the benchmark calibration. But they kind of perceive the wrong model, and they say, oh yeah, but there are no DTCs, endogenous DTCs, it's completely exogenous. So this -1 then is equal to the gamma, or to the -1 over sigma. So you run the optimal income tax in this model, and you compare the income tax and the wage distribution with the model that you have now, where the rho actually is positive. So the difference in the wage distribution and in the tax, you can attribute completely to the a misspecification, if you like, of the model, in the sense that the one would be the predictions if a researcher was not taking into account that technologies change endogenously through changes in the tax, while what you have is the full-blown correct, so to speak, model. And you could get a sense of the impact on the predictions by misspecifying the model. This kind of counterfactual exercises have been done a lot recently in the literature on income taxation, especially when we go to a dynamic world where things become quite complicated. So maybe you'll find them helpful. I have some other questions, but they're of technical nature. I skipped them because they were not in the presentation, but Jonas can look at them and take care of them, I guess, later on. And I have 2 more slides with more questions and extensions. So one is in the paper, I couldn't see what is the calibrated shape parameter of the log normal part of the earnings distribution. It would be interesting to have it because there are calibrations of this parameter in the income taxation literature. So just to see how these calibrated values change by taking into account the endogenous technical changes. I have a small, maybe I missed something, and again, it's not in the presentation, so I'm happy to get the answer later on. so in the paper, there is a Pareto tail which is fitting the earnings distribution, but the skill distribution is assumed to be uniform and therefore bounded. So I'm a bit, have a bit problem. How can we, because ultimately the earnings are related to the skills. At least we know from the theory there is a monotone relationship. So how can it be that, you know, we have a Pareto tail which requires an unbounded support, while the skill distribution is uniform? That I missed out there. So I don't know whether, you know, this can be clarified either here or in the paper. To deal with this problem, an alternative approach would be something which I did in a recent paper of mine, which, so there is this statistical, there is this distribution which is called Pareto log normal, which has 3 parameters. The 2 of them control, if you like, the log normal part of the distribution, and the 3rd parameter controls a Pareto tail. In the limit, this gives you a log normal distribution, but you can also, by playing around with the 3rd parameter, you can have a fat tail as you like. So the interesting exercise, actually one way to redo the exercise is to calibrate the skill distribution by using the Pareto log normal distribution. So you calibrate directly the skill distribution by matching, of course, the moments from the income distribution in the data. So that would be an alternative way to do the exercise without requiring to have this strange, for me, you know, combination of Pareto tail with uniform distribution, skill distribution. Of course, there could be a good reason behind this assumption, which I'm missing completely. So apologies for that. Yeah. So the last one, which comes again from my own background. So directed technical changes are inherently dynamic process, which is acknowledged actually at some part in the paper by Jonas. So my question when I read the paper, the natural one was why then not use a dynamic model? Because the model becomes quite quickly very complicated because everything happens at the same time in the static model. So you have to compare, you know, the change the labor changed the wages changed also from the change of the technology. Put all these things together, you know, you try to decipher all the effects in a neat way. And my guess would be that, for instance, if you had a 2-period model, where in the second period, the taxes take into account the technology as given, and in the first period, the taxes do recognize the impact they will have on the technology change, you could get basically the 2 effects separately, and you could see the effects on the taxes in the first half of the labor life and in the second half of the labor life. And in fact, by doing this, you could also try to answer questions about whether taxes should go up or down with the working life, which is quite a hot issue right now. And it has been discussed actually in other dynamic frameworks, for instance, by Stancheva and my paper with Pavan. And yeah, I think that would be interesting, which brings me, so now these 2 papers actually bring me to the last point. There is a link with the literature, with what this paper does and the literature that was mentioned in the introduction, and the literature on income taxation under human capital accumulation. So in that literature, we know that human capital accumulation can happen in 2 ways. One would be with direct investment in human capital, education, and so on. So there you can ask, well, how can I mix education subsidies with income taxes? And that's the work, for instance, by Stancheva in this literature. Of course, then you can have human capital accumulation as a side product of labor supply, and that's the so-called learning by doing, where almost by definition, by construction, there's nothing else you can do there other than the income tax. So you have one instrument, the income tax, that you can try to use it for 2 things. One is to affect the human capital accumulation and the inequality, which is more or less what you do here in terms of technical changes and so on. Because you assume that there are no instruments to affect the technical changes and you can use only the income tax to do both. And in fact, this is what is done in the paper with Pavan that I have. That's the spirit of the learning of the income tax, trying to affect human capital accumulation through the learning by doing and directly on the income taxation. So it would be interesting to bring a link with that literature. And this is it. Yeah, right on time. Thank you.
A little bit over. I
It's okay.
to stop you there. But thanks, Miltos. Jonas, you wanna reply right away?
Yeah, I can quickly respond.
Just briefly,
yes. So I won't respond to other points. I mean, that was super helpful. Thanks a lot for that. Also for that very, very extensive discussion. So I think two things, perhaps on 2 points, I can say something. So the bounded skill distribution and unbounded income distribution. Yeah, I mean, so the way I construct the income distribution at the moment, that to which I calibrate the model, is a bit of a patchwork. I just merge like a log linear and a Pareto tail. It's really so I talk of a Pareto tail. So by that I really mean I have a bounded income distribution, but like this Pareto coefficient. So it's something like this inverse hazard ratio of the income distribution that I showed you. That is constant. So that's what I mean with the Pareto tail, that this parameter or that this statistic is basically constant over the range of high incomes. And then at some point where you hit the upper bound of the income distribution, of course, it falls.
It's a truncated Pareto tail, basically. Yeah?
Excuse me?
It's a truncated Pareto tail.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, it is something like a truncated Pareto distribution, yes. I mean, it's a very helpful suggestion to look at this other way of calibrating this distribution. I think I'll definitely have a look at that. And then why not a dynamic model? Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So I think, so I mean, in a sense, I can construct like a dynamic model where all what I have here comes out like the static equilibrium that I have here comes out as a balanced growth path. What I lose by, so in a sense, I'm focusing on a balanced growth path of a dynamic model, I think. Of course, what I lose is like transition dynamics from the current to the new steady state and things like that. I do that because in these dynamic models, when you don't have like strongly restricted functional forms of the income tax, you get super complicated policies that do not look very realistic in many things. So there's a trade-off. I mean, there's a decision basically, do I want to have a dynamic model and restrict the tax function, or do I want to have an unrestricted tax function, but then I better go to the static model that I have here. And I've opted for the second option basically, but I see that this is it's not a clear decision, I think.
If I can jump in here, so there are new, so coming from the dynamic mechanism design world, there are now new techniques that allow you to do by bringing more of the dynamic mechanism design world here. There are now new techniques that allow you to characterize the optimal non-linear income tax without imposing restrictions. So, and again, I mean, these techniques have been used again in my paper with Pavan, or yeah. So maybe it would, maybe you can get some tricks from there. Hopefully. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I definitely see this point that direct technical change is a dynamic process. Why not use a dynamic model? I mean, on the other hand, I think there are simplicity reasons for going to the static model. Okay. But thanks for that discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It was lovely to read the paper. Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right, thanks. We have perhaps time for one more question from the floor, if there is an appetite for that.
Can I ask a question? Just a quick one. If I remember correctly, the R&D uses resources to produce. How would analysis change if instead R&D uses skilled labor?
That is so. If R&D firms use like final good, it's no change basically. If they use skilled labor, you get like a slightly different, an additional mechanism actually into that, because then with like the top income tax rates, basically you also affect the amount of R&D resources spent or the amount of R&D conducted in the economy. That's something I wanted to avoid, to really focus on these technical change channels. That would add another mechanism. I think it would call for lower marginal tax rate at the top. It's analyzed by in a recent paper by Charles Jones. I didn't want to have it in this paper because I think it's nice to have them. It's more clean to have them separate, these two channels. But of course, for like a full quantitative assessment of what is really the optimal tax, you would want to have it in. It's a bit of a shortcoming, but I think it's defensible on the grounds of transparency of the results. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we're almost on time to start the presentation of the final paper, which is given by Joachim Hubner.
Okay, great. Can you all see my slides? Perfect. Thanks so much for putting our paper on the program. This is joint work with Pascal Restrepo on the dynamics of the labor share at the firm level. So I think it is well known by now that the labor share has declined, at least in the US economy, as my discussant knows in particular. In other countries, this is not so clear cut, but this paper focuses on the US economy. And in particular, we want to know what happened in some of the major sectors that experienced very strong declines in the labor share, such as manufacturing in red here, where there was a 20-point decline in the labor share, but also other sectors such as retail and wholesale trade. And there's two broad explanations that have been proposed, and we are both addressing in this paper. The first one being technology, the substitution of capital for labor as the price of capital is falling and automation advances. And the second one we're also considering is concentration, the reallocation of value added to firms that have higher markups. And as a consequence, the aggregate markup in the economy is going up and the labor share is going down. Now, recently, there has been some very exciting evidence on what is going on at the firm level. I'm showing you here a picture for the manufacturing sector. This is a picture from Carrick and Vincent, which is basically saying that, like, for most of the firms in the economy, the labor share hasn't really changed, and we only see this movement in the aggregate. For example, in manufacturing, even though the aggregate labor share fell by 20 percentage points, for the median firm, actually the labor share slightly increased. Yeah. And this is presents somewhat of a challenge to the technology view, because it rules out a simple story where all firms face the same factor prices and have access to the same technologies. And it does suggest a key role for reallocation to high markup firms, because that story is fully consistent with this picture here and more generally with this evidence that we have now. So what we're doing in this paper is we are developing a firm dynamics model that can quantitatively address both of these candidate drivers. What is new here in terms of technology, we introduce costly capital labor substitution within tasks. And so what's happening in this model, and what can explain this evidence as well, is that as the price of capital is falling for the typical firm, there's going to be no change in the task allocation. And so effectively, capital and labor are going to complement at these firms. And so the labor share is going to go up as the price of capital is falling. On the other hand, for the top firms in the economy, as more tasks are automated, capital and labor are effectively substitutes at these firms. So the labor share is going down. The second channel, how we model is, we're going to have a non-CES demand system. So we're going to have size-dependent markups. And as the effective market size is increasing, the market shares of the top high markup firms are going up. And that's going to increase the aggregate markup in the economy. Just to quickly give you an idea of where we're heading, we are going to do a horse race between these two channels, sector by sector. And we find that in manufacturing, actually, capital labor substitution accounts for the majority of the labor share decline. But the picture is very different in other sectors, in particular in retail, for example. We find that capital labor substitution only accounts for 40% of the labor share decline. And the residual is accounted for by relocation to high markup firms. And then there's also a non-trivial interaction effect. Now, in the second part of the paper, and I'm not sure I'm going to have time for this today, but it's also very interesting, we do a sort of a model-free accounting of the contribution of markups to the labor share decline, in particular in light of our theory that technology might have evolved very differently across different firms. And we want to point out that, like, when you kind of incorporate differences in technology across firms, you also get a different inference for markups per se. All right, so let me outline the model. The model is a pretty standard firm dynamics model with these two ingredients that speak to the two channels, technology and concentration. So firms are going to be different only in terms of their productivity, C, exogenous factor neutral TFP, and the capital share parameter alpha, which is going to be an endogenous object. So they can change this over time. At a point in time, it's going to be fixed, but in the dynamic problem, it's going to be endogenous. The key assumption is that to raise the alpha, firms have to pay a constant fixed cost for each automated task. But the idea is that if you reallocate a task in some factory from a worker to, say, an industrial robot, to give you a stark example, you're not just paying basically the variable cost of either renting the robot or buying the robot and then expensing it, but you also very often need to pay a sizable upfront cost that accounts for both the installation and the reallocation, basically the reorganization of the production process. And an implication of this assumption will be that the adoption of new capital-intensive technology should be correlated with firm size. And that's exactly what we see in the data. So whether it is like industrial robots, but also like software or hardware spending, all these things are very much correlated with the number of employees a firm has. Okay, I'm going to tell you about the second part later on when we get to it. So at a point in time, the firm wakes up with an alpha and a C and produces according to this by now often used, task-based production function, where they need to combine a continuum of tasks indexed by X. E is going to be an important parameter. That's task level substitution elasticity. And then we say that the task from 0 to alpha, we say it's automated and can be produced by capital or by labor. And the tasks above alpha can only be done by labor. So we're basically ordering the tasks such that labor has a comparative advantage in the higher order tasks. And so the psi Ks and the psi Ls are going to be the labor and capital productivities, and they are going to be task specific. Now, on the demand side, we use a Kimball aggregator. So the way this works is that the output of all the firms, the Y theta, where theta is now the firm type that summarizes, a C and the alpha. You're integrating over that and you're implicitly solving for aggregate output according to this equation here. So that's basically a generalization of the standard CES aggregator. The one new element here we have here is that we put in lambda as one of our shocks. So lambda is going to change over time, and that's an exogenous proxy for the effective size of the market. It looks a bit mysterious, but when you look at the implied demand function, demand for a firm is going to be proportional not just to aggregate output, but also to this effective market size. And then there's going to be a demand function D that's going to be, it's going to be derived from the Kimball aggregator, from the primitive H. But note that essentially this says that, as in the standard CES demand model, you have that the state of competition can be summarized by a price index. So your demand depends on your relative price, so the price that you are charging, you can choose P of theta, divided by what we call here rho. So rho is going to be an endogenous object. It's going to be the competitor price index. It's a bit complicated because there's now two price indices, not just one, but this essentially summarizes the state of competition. Now we need to there's two parts of this, of the key assumption that is sometimes called Marshall's second law or laws. It's actually two pieces. There's a weak and a strong version. So the assumption here is that the demand elasticity is greater than 1 as always, but it's also increasing in X, so increasing in the relative price. And so because of that, the larger, more productive firms, they are facing a lower demand elasticity and they're going to choose a higher markup. And we get that the markup is increasing firm size as tends to be estimated in the data. The second assumption is somewhat related, is saying that marginal revenue is positive and log concave. It is distinct because it implies that the pass-throughs are also lower for more productive firms. So very quickly, the dynamics, I just want to point out one element. So the value function is pretty simple. The firm wakes up with the C and the alpha, collects some profit, and so on and so forth. The key element here is that, the automation cost, they can choose a higher alpha for next period. Yeah. And if they do so, they need to pay this constant fixed cost of automation. Yeah. There's also endogenous entry and exit, and the C is exogenous, so there's going to be an exogenous markup process for firm productivity. So on the equilibrium, the capital supply is fully elastic, and capital is produced from the final good at a constant rate Q. That's going to be a second shock. On the labor side, it's very simple. Labor is in fixed supply and fully mobile across all firms. So let me now zoom into the key elements here, the two shocks. What we're doing in this experiment, we're starting the economy in a steady state in 82 inside the two driving forces of the labor share over this 30-year period where there's good data at the micro level. The first component, technology, we consider uniform increase in Q. That's just a standard notion of investment-specific technical change. I mean, in this setup, actually, the Q in general depends. I mean, there should be a different Q for each task. It's just very difficult to tease this out from the data. So in our baseline experiment, we're just going to consider uniform increases in Q. Now, note that this primarily affects the labor share of cost that we call epsilon L. It has some effects on the markups as well in equilibrium, but primarily, of course, acts on the labor share of cost. And then the second shock we're considering is an increase in lambda, which is a little bit harder to interpret, and there's not really a clear empirical proxy for it. But so that's why we're going to infer this through the lens of the model, the size of this shock. What you have in mind is a rising effective market size driven by, for example, the expansion of like ICT technologies, and now it's easier to compare prices, say, on the internet through search engines. Now, in this setup, the labor share of value added, the object that we see in the data in the end, or at least we hope to see, it's not trivial sometimes, can be written simply as the ratio of the labor share of cost that we call epsilon L and the markup mu. I want to point out that the same holds for the aggregate economy when you take appropriate averages for each of these objects. Yeah. Now, on the first component, the key to understand is that to note that in each period of time, there's going to be an alpha that we call alpha star that minimizes the production costs, so not taking into account the automation costs. And that's just the task threshold where the marginal cost of labor equals the marginal cost of capital. Note that alpha star is going to be a strictly increasing function of Q, just because the alpha star is going to be an increasing function of the relative price of labor. Okay. And in this setup, what does the optimal automation choice look like in a dynamic problem of the firm? It's going to be an increasing function of firm productivity, and in particular, it's going to have the following form. A firm is always going to choose either stay with the current alpha, because there's kind of an option value of having a higher alpha in our setup, or if they automate, they do it according to this function here, this alpha head function. That's the target automation level of a firm with productivity C. And for low enough C, it's not going to be any automation. Yeah, so their target automation level is 0, and they're just going to stick to the current alpha. The limit, firms that are large enough, they are going to automate fully. When we're automating fully, we refer to the fact that they are going to choose an alpha that equals or approaches in the limit the cost minimizing alpha. So this model produces automation episodes whenever the alpha head function crosses the current alpha for growing and large firms. So for growing firms, if they have been, behind the frontier, basically, but also for large firms that have always been large, maybe they were always at the frontier, but if the frontier is moving, they also want to automate. Now, I won't have much time to go into the quantitative aspects of calibration, but quickly I want to point out that in terms of the technology, there are multiple capital labor elasticities in this model. There's a notion of a short-run capital labor elasticity. That is the one when you fix the alpha, yeah, and that's equal to the task substitution elasticity. So that for sure has to be very close to 0, definitely below 1. We use a value of 0.4 from Warfield and Raval. And so the implication is that for small firms, the labor share of costs is actually going to go up as the price of capital is falling. And then there's a notion of a long-run capital labor elasticity that also incorporates the adjustment of alpha, and that's going to be equal to the short-run elasticity plus a term that accounts for the task reallocation that you can get an expression from that I didn't put up here, but essentially it's going to be a function of the steepness of the comparative advantage schedule, right? You're going to choose a value of 1.35. That's the one I estimated in my job market paper. And also pretty close to the value estimated in long-run cross-country data by Karabunis and Niemann. So for large firms, what's going to happen is that in response to falling capital prices, their labor shares of cost are going to go down. For the automation fixed cost, ideally, that's where we're going. You want to match the capital technology adoption rates by firm size. That's kind of the most natural equivalent. For today, we don't have that yet. We need to wait for some data being disclosed from the US Census. For today, we are kind of choosing the automation fixed cost residually to kind of target the change in the median labor share given the other changes. It turns out we're going to back out an automation fixed cost that's pretty small. It's going to be, to give you an idea, it's going to be smaller in terms of the aggregate spending on the automation fixed cost, smaller than the rise in R&D spending in the US economy. So less than 1% of aggregate output at any point in time. Now, the second key model component is this non-CS demand system. So here we are plotting the markup as a function of the unit cost of a firm. So basically here on the right, the firms with higher unit costs, low productivity. And you see that the markup in this non-CS demand system is not constant, but it's in general falling in the unit cost, so increasing in productivity. The pass-through is also higher for high cost firms, so it's lower for the large superstar firms. And the relation between firm productivity and sales is also different. In particular, sales are actually bounded. Okay, so you cannot infinitely expand your sales, even if you lower your price to 0. Now the shock, the lender effectively increases the market size and pushes firms towards the elastic section of their demand curve. And so it lowers the markup for all firms because of this. Okay. So it definitely also lowers the aggregate markup via this channel only, but at the same time, because the pass-through is lower for the superstar firms, it also reallocates economic activity towards the top firms. These are the ones with the higher markups. And so you can show that there's going to be a net increase in the aggregate markup if and only if the C distribution, so the fundamental productivity distribution, is log convex. And what does it mean? Well, it turns out the Pareto distribution is the benchmark where these two effects exactly cancel out. So that tells us we need to be careful on the data to kind of capture the right degree of log convexity, which, in intuitive terms is kind of top-end sales concentration. So what we're doing in light of this picture, we are targeting a couple of moments of firm sales concentration, because by targeting this, we can back out the distribution in productivity. And we're also targeting the dispersion in markups across firms. Yeah. So we do all that, and what we get in the end. Okay, sorry, I haven't told you about the other key component of the calibration. So there are two shocks in this model: the Q and the lender. Yeah. And at least for the lender, it's really hard to get any empirical proxy for this. For Q, you could get an average change in the price of capital. What matters would be kind of the change in the price of capital at the marginal task. But since we cannot really see the lender in the data anyways, we're backing these two out jointly by matching the decline in the aggregate labor share and the observed rise in concentration. And we're doing this sector by sector. the results are going to be quite different across sectors. Now, in manufacturing, we find that, I mean, first of all, the full model, you know, does a good job at matching all these moments here. The interesting thing in this table here is to look at is that basically this estimation tells us that the price of capital shock explains almost, that's the Q shock alone explains almost the full decline in the aggregate labor share manufacturing. And why is this? Well, it's because it also explains almost the full rise in concentration. You don't really need to load anything on the Lander shock because the falling price of capital already generates a pretty big increase in sales concentration. And why is this in this model? Well, it's because they're already more productive firms, endogenously are automating more. So you're generating actually an increase in productivity dispersion that's actually very much in line with the data. And that in turn generates an increase in sales concentration. So, you know, that's a picture of the labor share by firm sales percentile over time. In the steady state, technology is uniform. And then over time, what is happening, capital becomes cheaper, the labor shares of small firms increase. And the firms that are large, they are decreasing their labor shares because they're also automating. Yeah. So you get this kind of clockwise rotation of the labor share of cost by size schedule. Now, let me skip this. Let me just point out that in some of the other sectors, we get very different results. Let us focus on retail here. In retail, the labor share drops by 10 percentage points. The full model, again, can rationalize this, but the Q shock alone only explains 40%. And so we load 20% or 2 points on the Lander shock and a pretty large interaction term. Now, first of all, why do we infer that concentration is more important in the sector? Well, there's two kind of data moments that inform this. First of all, the level of top-end sales concentration is higher in this sector. So that means, that already means that any kind of Lander shock is more powerful. And second, we also infer a bigger increase in the effective market size just because the increase in sales concentration has also been much stronger in retail. Okay, so for these two reasons, we get a larger role for this. The interaction effect is kind of coming from the fact that these two shocks reinforce each other, which is interesting. So, the large firms automating means there's actually bigger differences in labor shares across firms. So any relocation is more powerful. And in turn, the large firms having higher market shares means they're also automating more. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, I think I have maybe 4 or 5 minutes that I want to use to show you something else, give you at least a taste of it that is quite interesting. So we do now a purely empirical exercise, estimating markups purely empirically. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this, first of all, because so far we only accounted for the size-dependent component of markups. Yeah, and in principle, there can be much more markup variation in the data. And so we do an exercise that is kind of similar in spirit to the exercises of the Locker, Eckert, and Unger, and Bakai and Farhi. And we're just estimating markups in Compostat. Need some strong assumptions, as the literature does, using the so-called production function approach. How does this work? Well, you first estimate the production function, meaning the only thing you really need is the epsilons. First, I told you the epsilon else, that's the labor sharing cost. We're estimating here the epsilon V because we only observe variable costs, not labor separately. And so this epsilon is at the same time, so it's defined as the labor share, it's defined of the share of variable inputs in cost, of course you don't observe that, but it's also equal by cost minimization to the elasticity, so the output elasticity of variable inputs. Yeah. And so once you estimate the epsilons, you can back out the markup pretty simply, just from cost minimization as the ratio of this elasticity divided by, this is now the share of variable inputs in, it's going to be in sales now, not in value added. Yeah, so the S is something you observe, the epsilon you have to estimate. That's where all the action is. Basically, the higher epsilon you're estimating, the higher the markup is you're going to back out. Yeah. The only difference from, for example, the exercise in the Locker, Eckert, and Unger is that we allow technology to vary not only by time period and industry, but also by firm size, because of course that's an implication of our model that should be important. And the reason I'm showing you this now is that that's exactly what we see in the data. Okay, so it's not just that we kind of want to kind of validate our markup business, but to some extent we also validate our kind of story on technology, because we find that when you plot this variable import elasticities across firm size quintiles, you see that in 60s and 70s, you get this straight line, so it's flat, and then it's rotating downwards, so it's rotating clockwise. Whereas in the model, the large firms kind of decrease the importance of variable inputs, and vice versa, increase the importance of capital, because at some point we impose that these have to sum to 1, these elasticities. And so this has implications for markups itself. You know, here we have some replication of the exercise in the log Eckert and Unger. That's the top line. The red line is kind of doing the same thing, but using the correct weighting when you care about the aggregate labor share. There's still a pretty strong increase of around 10% in the aggregate markup since the 80s. Now, the difference between the red line and the black line is when you in addition account for differences in technology across firms, you see get an even weaker increase in the markup. Though still depends when you start. Starting the 80s, still 5% increase. And you know, once you have kind of all the markups at the firm level and at the aggregate level, you can look at the contribution of markups to the labor share decline. And also, as our kind of theory would predict, what we see over time is that within firms, markups are going down, which means that the contribution of markups of within firm markup changes to the labor share is actually positive over time. Okay, and versus the relocation component is negative, meaning there has been a relocation to high markup firms, also in the Compostat data. And when we look at the magnitudes, relocation explains 1/5 to 1/2 of the labor share decline, 1/5 in manufacturing, at most 1/2 in the other sectors, which is kind of nice because it's somewhat in line with what we found in our purely model-based decomposition. Okay, so last slide, we had a model of capital labor substitution with fixed cost per task that matches the firm level effects on the decline of the labor share manufacturing. In other sectors, in particular retail, it looks at rising competition and relocation to high markup firms, somewhat more important. And we're gonna highlight that even if you just care about estimating the markups, it's important to allow for differences in technology across firms. Thanks a lot. And let me stop here.
Great, thank you very much. The discussant is Sophie Piton.
Hi everyone. So let me share my slides. Okay, so can you see my slides? Yes.
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much, Joachim. I thought that was a very clear presentation. I really enjoyed reading the paper. So let me start with actually Joachim's starting point for the paper, which is the well-known decline in the US labor share. So we've been discussing this decline for quite some years now, with many papers emphasizing that the challenge is even to measure the labor share. But while the decline, I think, has been challenged outside the US, it seems that there is a decline in the US labor share, and that's robust to a series of measurement issues. So if I can summarize briefly these measurement issues, so there is a treatment of mixed income, that is self-employment income. So I don't think your main measures here of the labor share adjust for this, but so basically the mixed income includes both the remuneration of the work and the profits of self-employed. So you need to estimate wages for the self-employed and adjust for that in your main measure of the labor share. And on top of this, there's in recent years has been a rise in the number of pass-through businesses, that is businesses that for tax motivation declare the income as capital rather than labor income. And that includes also S corporations are including the corporate sector, and that's a bigger and bigger issue that Smith et al. Show in their paper. And so, but even if you account for those self-employed and pass-through businesses, we do observe a decline in the labor share, and especially since the early 2000s. 2000. The second issue is the role of housing that Matt Ronley has been put forward in 2015. And again, even if the rise of housing and value added explains a large portion of the decline in the total economy labor share, it doesn't affect here your industrial level measures. And there also have been some papers showing the importance of adjusting the labor share for the increasing depreciation of capital. And so as the economy uses more and more intangible capital, and as intangible capital tends to depreciate faster than other forms of capital, trends in net labor share, so that's labor share adjusted for depreciation, might differ from trends in gross labor shares. And so, but again, so I will summarize all of these adjustments in this figure, which shows the decline in the corporate sector labor share, that's the dotted line. So that's free of the housing issue. The gross labor share for the business sector, that's a solid line, so that's free of the housing and the self-employment issue. And finally, the dashed line, that's free of all three issues that I've just mentioned. And as you can see, for the period of analysis that Joachim's focusing on here, which is 1982 up to 2012, so in between the two vertical lines, you can see a decline in the US labor share. So this observation of a decline in the labor share have triggered a long search of explanation. So Joachim's paper focuses on the two main ones here. So the first one being the effect of automation technologies that could lead to a permanent replacement of labor with capital. The other one being a competition explanation. So with high markup, low labor share firm gaining more and more market shares over time. So something we refer to most often as a superstar firm theory or winner take all dynamics. But there are also other explanations that have been investigated, such as the role of outsourcing, the role of offshoring and international trade, and the decline in the bargaining power of workers. But very few theories to date, or at least what I've seen, can explain the microanatomy of the labor share. And this is what I enjoyed most with this paper, that it's very neatly replicating the detailed fact that has been put forward in the literature. So let me give a bit more description of what I mean by the microanatomy of the labor share. Well, Joachim already showed this picture, but so that's a figure that's from the Caring and Vincent paper that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, where they document rigorously the dynamics of the labor share in the US manufacturing sector. So here we really focus on the manufacturing sector. And what important and striking dynamic that they show is that the labor share decline is mostly a reallocation effect. That is a reallocation of market shares toward low labor share firms. And so they also show that this reallocation is not due to entry or exits, it's not due to superstars firm growing faster or for large establishments lowering the labor shares, but that it's due to some units whose labor share fell as these units were growing in size. So that's a very important and a surprising fact that was put forward before. And so that really enjoy this paper, because this paper is able to rationalize this very precise anatomy of the US manufacturing labor share. So let me go briefly into the main ingredients of the paper. So that's a very rich paper. So I invite you to read the paper because it's extremely rich. There are two main mechanisms. And then he also described all this work on market estimation, which I will not discuss here. So really, please do read the paper. It's very rich. But the main contribution I thought was particularly interesting is to build a model with an endogenous adoption of automation technology that affects firms differently, or at least in the transition, at least in the short run. So in this framework, firms can adopt a new technology subject to a fixed cost. And because of this fixed cost, most productive or larger firms adopt the automation technology only, implying that there are different degrees of automation adoption across firms. But as technology, there's also a mechanism for technology diffusion. And so new firms that enter also adopt the average automation technology of incumbent firms, so that in the long run, we should have all firms adopting the same level of automation technology. So they calibrate this specific automation model first on US data and show that they can very convincingly replicate the main facts that Kerrigan and Vincent put forward. So that we observe a decline, so that the observed decline in the price of capital since the early 1980s can explain the reallocation of market shares towards low labor share firms, and more specifically, this very fact that the adoption of new technology of a firm increases the labor share of this firm, and these firms in the meanwhile is gaining market share. So this very fact that Kerry and Vincent put forward, that it is the aggregate labor share is falling because they have some firms that are a lower labor share and grow in size at the same time. And there are also other different like interesting results from the model. The first one is the divergence between the short run and long run capital labor elasticity of substitution. So the task level elasticity and the aggregate elasticity can diverge if firms have different degrees of automation adoption. So I think that's related to a paper also by Josepa. So I invite you to discuss with him, because I think here your results are very close. And they also show that I thought was super interesting, that in the long run, if technology like automation technology keeps diffusing, we should see a further decline in the aggregate labor share. So the decline in the labor share should not be finished yet. We should see still a further decline as medium firms automate. So on top of this already very rich automation framework, they do have this competition effect, which is very building on the papers by Bakkay and Ferry, with heterogeneous markup and pass-throughs across firms, with, as Amity and Ishkoki and co-authors showed using Belgium data, that they also assume that there are larger markups for larger firms, so higher markups for larger firms. And so using this framework, they show how an increasing competition can lead also to a reallocation to high markup, low labor share firms. And whereas the automation effect explains most of what's happening in the manufacturing sector, this competition effect can explain what is happening in the retail and wholesale sector, and is also amplified by its interaction with its automation effect. So although the interaction is an interesting point. So let me turn quickly to my first comment. So for the first comment, my concern is about the contribution of including the competition effect in the paper. So while I think that the automation bit of the model is very convincing because it neatly replicates most of the facts that we see in the US manufacturing labor share, I'm not sure about the contribution of the competition effects yet. So as I've said, if you focus on the manufacturing sector, you can replicate very neatly this fact by Kerry and Vincent, and precise fact that the decline in the aggregate labor share is due to these units whose labor share fell of the green size. But what they also show in their paper, and I think that's a very surprising fact, is that they decompose the decline in the labor share, and they look at the productivity and price component of the temporary decline in the labor share. And they show that the labor share declines because these specific units experience a temporary price increase and have a price premium. And actually, your competition effect here cannot capture this price effect, because the increased competition will lead to a decline in prices. So I don't see very much the contribution of adding the competition effect, at least for the manufacturing sector. Outside of the manufacturing sector, I'm not even convinced there's any decline in the labor share to explain. So I'll show you in the figure, so what you're using of the mainline measure is the payroll share. So you don't adjust for self-employment, but self-employment is very important, especially in retail, where there's a lot of self-employment. So there's a small decline if you use a clean measure of the labor share. And given the significant additional measurement issues in this sector, so if you think of the Smith paper looking at pass-through businesses, the role of pass-through businesses, this issue seems to be concentrated mostly in service sectors, and the retail sector is one of the most important sectors in which facing this issue. And so if you look at what the figure look like, I'm not even convinced you have anything to explain in terms of labor share in this sector. So this figure shows the labor share in manufacturing sector adjusted for self-employment, and the labor share in the retail sector, and the decline in the retail sector is very tiny compared to what's happening in the manufacturing sector. So my second comment is maybe going a bit outside of the scope of this paper, and asks how the paper speaks to the facts that we see outside the US. So this figure compares the US to Europe. So on aggregate, there is a decline in the US manufacturing, in the US labor share, not in Europe. But let's look at the specific manufacturing sector. And what you can see that even in Europe, on average, the manufacturing sector labor share is not decreasing. Well, you can think, okay, well, there are some countries like the UK, for instance, with no automation. Like the manufacturing sector is so small, they're not adopting some automation technology. So maybe that's like a composition effect. There are some countries in which the labor share falls, others where it does not. But if you think about this, you look at the country level manufacturing sector labor share, and you can see that the labor share is not declining in any of at least the main 4 countries, Germany, France, the UK, and Italy. And if you look at some rough measure of automation, so out of curiosity, I look at imports of robots. So using trade data, like what is the value and the volume of import of robots? And you do see a large increase in imports of robots, at least in Germany. So you'd expect this automation effect to be at play, at least in Germany, but yet you don't see the result of a decline in the labor share in Germany. So it would be great to know whether it is the amount of automation, because here I don't compare to the US. I don't know how that compares to the US. So what would be in your model, the automation trend that we would see in Europe to explain such a difference in labor share trends between the US and Europe? So to sum up, I really enjoy reading the paper, and I thought it very convincingly shows how the model is able to replicate the facts by Kerry and Vincent for the US manufacturing sector labor share. The framework is very neat. The automation, the way you model automation is super interesting, and this implication that as automation technology should diffuse more, by diffusing more to more firms will translate into a further decline in the manufacturing sector labor share, I thought is extremely interesting. As I've mentioned, I'm not yet convinced by the competition effect in retail, and not least because I'm not yet convinced there's an actual decline in the retail sector labor share. So the final point I just made, so I wonder how this model speaks to what is happening in Europe. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Joachim, would you like to respond?
Yes, thanks a lot for this very nice and kind discussion that raised a number of additional points. Yeah, so perhaps it's good that you mentioned some details on the firm level evidence that I kind of didn't have time to explain in the presentation. So what's very interesting, maybe to reiterate on that for the audience, is that like I was maybe a little bit too generous to the competition story in the very beginning, in the sense that it is actually like in the Kerry and Vincent evidence, at least, it's actually not the case that there's a pure relocation to low labor share firms in the data, but at the same time, the market shares of those firms are growing when they are lowering their labor shares, okay? So it's not that the labor share is falling for some firms or that the market share is going up for low labor share firms, it's both things happening at the same time, which is not very easy to interpret. And in the Kerry and Vincent paper, they kind of interpret this as evidence kind of against, as you're saying, against kind of the superstar firms mechanism that's pushed in there, for example, the Auto et al. Paper. It's a little bit tricky because, and that's where the model actually helps, because through the lens of our model with a non-CS demand system and mean reversion productivity, you actually see this kind of like very strong kind of negative covariance term where growing firms are lowering their labor shares. You see that all the time, even in a steady state in our model, simply because whenever they're more productive, they're larger, right? But they're also larger, so they're going to charge a higher markup. So you're going to observe a lower labor share in the data. So that really helps to have kind of a structural model, because like it kind of helps interpret the data that is otherwise very mysterious. But that being said, you're still right. Even in like in the balanced panel, it's really about like firms that are growing and automating, and yeah, it seems to support actually more the automation story in manufacturing, also in terms of this micro level evidence, which is then anyways what we find for the sector. And for the other sectors, yeah, it's a bit trickier, as you're saying, because for the other sectors we don't have the data on compensation over value added, but like what the other papers look at is usually payroll over sales. And as Sophie's told us, is that kind of a lot of measurement issues are coming in, and so it's not totally clear to what extent this decline in labor share in other sectors is really even there. I mean, that being said, we just kind of went with kind of the facts as assembled in the other literature, and yeah, we don't have that much more to say about that point. I mean, I agree, it's not super clear what's happening in the other sector. Yeah, the point about the robots, I mean, and also other sectors, I mean, clearly this cannot just be a story about robots, but this has to be a story of all kinds of adoption of capital technologies, because robots by itself cannot be powerful enough, right, to explain a 20 percentage points labor share decline. But yeah, it is definitely an open question why we don't see this in other countries in manufacturing. And the point on diffusion is also something we're kind of working on right now. So the paper we have, and then so if you looked at, kind of had like some element of diffusion of technology, where basically in the very long run, the firms are all converging. And because kind of the entrants are kind of sampling an average alpha, in the very long run, they're kind of all converging to the steady state alpha star, to the cost minimizing level of automation. And it's not really clear if that's a good assumption, right? And so we are kind of exploring other model versions now where there's no diffusion. What you're going to have then is you're going to have, even in a steady state, you're going to have differences in technology across firms. Because basically firms are going to enter the economy and not going to have capital intensive technologies yet. But it looks like over the sample period, these 30 years, not really much is changing. The bigger changes kind of in the future going forward. So basically in the model that we had so far, the typical firm a lot is changing, of course, in the future when the technology is diffusing. And if it's not, then they're kind of staying at their kind of average technology level. So yeah, so that's going to be more important for kind of predicting the future. Yeah, and predicting what's happening kind of to these typical firms. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Are there any more questions from the floor? Yes, Aida.
Yes, thank you. It seems like the decline in the prices is the main explanatory variable that you have at the moment, which is similar to Barbonis and Newman. And that has gone down, not just in the UK, but in all the rest of the countries. So what do you think is different in Europe and other places that we have not observed the same decline in the labor share?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have much to say, but since you mentioned it in the paper by Barbonis and Newman, they were actually comparing the magnitudes of the price of capital, of the declines in the price of the aggregate investment good across countries, and they found that, the stronger the decline is, the stronger is the labor share decline. And they kind of use this kind of cross-country panel setting to kind of conclude that, I guess, 1/2 or so of the global decline of the labor share, it's not so clear how much of this actually survives some of the measurement challenges, is explained by kind of falling capital prices. So, I mean, in the cross-section of countries, we do see that stronger declines, the price of capital are associated with stronger labor share declines. I mean, kind of, so the lens of this model gets a bit trickier because in the end, what matters is really what's happening to the price of capital at these marginal tasks. So it's kind of not so obvious which kind of capital price index you want to look at. But yeah, we don't have like much to say about much more to say about why you don't see some of these things in other countries. It's certainly an interesting question. Yeah. I mean, it's possible that there are, for example, I mean, I guess there's two ways of interpreting this. One way is that there must be something different in the US, but the other thing is maybe it's also that kind of, it's really easy about technology, but in some of the other countries, there's maybe just stronger regulation on the labor market side or general, and just don't see these changes yet or so, or yeah.
Thanks. Elisa.
Yeah, just a small related point. But thank you for the presentation, by the way, it was great. So when you compare cross countries, if you also look at the time series of the decline in the price of capital to consumption in the US, it kind of started much earlier, say, than in the 80s. and it was particularly, it was, I mean, I don't know if exactly as strong, but it was, I guess, of comparable size. But I guess part of the difference is the type of capital, right? I guess, because computers, communication equipment, and all of that came kind of after the 80s. So probably some component of which capital good is actually becoming more efficient over time might be something of what's going on in terms of the difference before, say, the 1980s and after the 1980s.
Yeah, it's a very nice point. I mean, through the lens of the model, for example, if the price of capital is falling for certain types of capital that cannot be used for the marginal task, right? Then actually the relevant substitution elasticity is just the lower task, is kind of just the lower level of the eta that I told you about. And so then you shouldn't see any decline in labor share anyways. But I think in terms of, that's actually, it's something I looked at in my job market paper. So when you look at the price of capital in the US, depending on the measure, you do see a decline even before the 1980s, but it's a much weaker decline. So after the 1980s, even the aggregate capital price index declines much more strongly. So I mean, I argue in that paper that there's some competing effects on the demand side, but in general, it's not, it even picked up in the aggregate. But then in addition, of course, it depends on what kind of capital. And ICT might just be more substitutable, which in this framework would be picked up as being more likely to be used at marginal tasks. Yeah.
I have a short one.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, Joachim, very nice paper. So I'm curious about, it's a more like food for thought. I'm curious about what you guys think about this from a historical perspective. We used to think that the labor share was constant. We believed in counterfacts. It's not the first time, the first wave of innovation in automation that we've seen in history. So do you have any idea of historical series of labor share? If in previous automation periods, there has been a decline in labor share and then come back, or maybe, I don't know, an idea on that?
I don't have a strong idea. The only thing I can tell you is that in my job market paper, I looked at starting in the 50s only in the US. I kind of looked at this idea, and ideally you'd go back even further. But like my story is, and I found some evidence for that from the 50s to the 80s, you did also have capital labor substitution that by itself pushed down the labor share and the aggregate, but you also had a reallocation, and you still have it, of demand to the kind of more labor intensive sectors of the economy. And like, going further back, I mean, I didn't do it in my paper, but I mean, my kind of general idea or intuition is that like, it's kind of natural, right, for sectors to get more and more automated over time, but demand is then reallocating to newer sectors. I mean, the very long run, you look at agriculture, right, and it's incredibly mechanized by now.
So you think that the stage of structural transformation really, really matters?
I think that, yeah, there's competing effects from the demand side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We have, by the way, long-run evidence on labor share. Sorry, just to come in on Nacho's point, we do have evidence on long-run labor share. Yeah. And what you see is kind of, I think, what you have in mind, which is around the Industrial Revolution, kind of long falls and then recovery, kind of a very slow-moving dynamic. So to the extent that we know, it looks a little bit like that.
That's a good point, yeah.
Right. Okay, so that then concludes the first day of our workshop. Thank you all very much for your contributions today. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope we continue equally fruitful tomorrow at the workshop. So tomorrow we use the same Zoom link, and we start at 9:30 British Summer Time. Hope to see you then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.